Welcome to Digital Literacy, a guide to using technology in journalism. This presentation is brought to you by the Henry W. Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. All right, in this video we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk a little bit more about cropping, and we're going to talk about how we tone our image, how we adjust brightness and contrast and levels and things like that so that we can make it look a little bit better. So let's go ahead and start with cropping. So we talked about cropping in one of the previous videos. I've got the crop tool selected over here on the left. I've got it set for unconstrained, and this is all blank here because I want to be able to crop to whatever makes sense for the image. So the way I would start is I'm going to go up here and I'm going to grab the upper left hand corner, and I'm just going to drag in a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to crop to emphasize the part of the image I want people to pay attention to. So I don't really care about my referee friend over here on the right hand side. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag in. And you can pick any one of those corner points, and I'm going to go ahead and take him out. I'm pretty tight up here on the top. See how I've got just a little bit of space there? I want to get about the same amount of space down here on the bottom so that it sort of feels even and that it flows. Now, one of the problems that I have with this image, now that I've cropped in a little bit tighter, is that my horizon isn't quite straight. And so if I move just outside the box, you can see at the corners, my cursor becomes this sort of double arrowed curve. And what that'll allow me to do is if I click and drag now, I can rotate this box. And so what I want to try and do is match my horizontal lines, so like here and the fence. And then I can go ahead and I can hit return, and that's going to apply that crop. So that's where we started, and that's where we ended up. And that's just Command Z to undo and then redo that image there. Now, one of the things we'll talk a lot about throughout the course of the semester when it comes to cropping is this idea of what do you crop into and what don't you crop into. And the general rule of thumb is when you crop into something, you de-emphasize it. You're saying, this is not important. I'm not showing all of it to you because it's not that important. And so I've cropped into him. He's not that important. I might even come in a little bit more here, maybe just to the edge of his knee, and say, yeah, he's even less important than before. Now, this guy down here and the player here, they're the important ones. So I want to make sure that my focus stays on them. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and crop that. And I'm going to hit Command 0 to fill that up. Because the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about toning the image. And by toning the image, what I mean is we're going to go through and we're going to adjust the brightness and the contrast of the image so that it more accurately reflects what we saw while we were making the image. And that's an important rule in Photoshop for journalism, is that you only want to make adjustments that bring the image back to what you saw while you were there. Not what you wanted to see, but what you actually saw. So Photoshop is an inherently destructive program. Every adjustment that you make in Photoshop, that's going to degrade your image quality in some way, shape, or form. So you want to do as few adjustments as possible. But we use it to overcome the technical limitations of photography, of digital photography. So when we bring up image and then adjustments, we're going to see the top three things here: brightness, contrast, levels, and curves. Levels and curves, if you've never worked in Photoshop, you have no idea what those are, but your standard response is, I need to adjust brightness and contrast. I'm going to bring up the brightness and contrast sliders here. The problem with brightness and contrast is that it sort of hammers away at the entire image, sort of indiscriminately, and it doesn't give you a whole lot of control over your image. So my recommendation is stay away from brightness and contrast, which is sort of an odd thing to say. But what we're going to do is we're going to adjust brightness and contrast using levels and curves. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up levels. Just so you know, the shortcut for levels is Command L if you want to bring it up real quick. And what it's going to give us is our histogram here. This is telling us how many pixels we have at different places throughout. So it starts at 0 over here, so this is our blacks or our deep dark shadow tones, and then moves up to 255 over here on the right, so this is our highlight area. And this map is going to be different for every single image that you have shot, because some images are going to have lots of contrast, lots of darkness, lots of highlights, not much in the midtones. This image has a lot of midtones, not a lot in the highlights, not a lot in the shadows there. So the first thing that I do when I bring up levels is I take a look at the ends here, and I want to make sure that I have pixels that go all the way out to the end, and here I just barely do. So what I might do here is just to deepen the blacks a little bit, is I'm going to grab this little home plate, this black triangle over here, and sort of scoot it to the left. And the more I bring it in, the more you can see it's deepening those shadows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it over to just about where it starts to build up there. And on the highlight end, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to tweak it in a little bit. Now, what I like to do, I'm going to undo both of these here real quick, is when I'm doing this, I like to hold down the Option key, because when I come over to the highlight side, don't freak out, this whole thing's going to change here, and I move this just a little bit, my image goes black. And then as I start to move this over to the left, what it does is it starts to map it and tell me those are the pixels that you're going to peak out at 255 on. So where it's pure white, like on the shoulder there in the center, what that's telling me is that red, green, and blue have all peaked out at 255. The blues have peaked out at 255 just below that. You can see some reds over there. I want to try not to blow my highlights. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back off a little bit to about where I was. Now sometimes you are going to end up losing highlights. Like if I lost the highlights in the number 5 on this player over here, I'm not going to worry about it a whole lot. And on the shadow side here, I can do the same thing. It's going to turn my screen to white, and then as I move it in, it starts to show me where those pixels bottom out at 0. And once again, if I just move that a little bit, that's going to start my toning process. So I always start here in levels, and then I click OK, and you can see that that's again appeared on my history palette. Now this is the much more confusing one. This is what's called curves. And curves are really important because this, and I'm going to slide, all I'm sliding out is the OK and cancel stuff over there so that we can see a little bit more. This is the most unfortunately named tool ever, because you open up curves and what you end up with is this straight diagonal line. And you can see that you've got that histogram there. It goes from the shadow side to the highlight side, but you'll also see that you've got a vertical one here. So down here, this is your input. This is what you're starting with, and then you're going to remap some of these areas of pixels using the upright line over here, and it's a little confusing at first, but you get used to it after a while. And what we'll do is we're just going to click and set a point someplace in here in the middle, and then if we drag that up and to the left, you'll see that we brighten the image. If you take it down and to the right, you'll see that we darken the image. So that's the first way that you can start adjusting brightness and contrast here. But what this allows us to do is this allows us to say, okay, I've got my midtones about where I want them, but my shadows here, they're not quite right. So what I can do now is I can click here and I can drag this down, and by creating a very gentle S, I can increase the contrast in my image. Or if I go the opposite direction, I can take contrast out if I had a very, very high contrast kind of an image. Now you don't want to go too far, because all of a sudden you're back to your parents' and grandparents' psychedelic 1960s era, so we don't want to do that. But you just want to put a very gentle curve on most images to bring up that contrast ever so slightly. And you can put multiple points on here, so if I didn't want this part to move too much, I could anchor that, and now what I can do is I can just affect that lower part of the image there. So I'm going to bump up that contrast just a touch. Now, we've looked at the info palette, I think, before, and the info palette allows us to mouse over. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and then I'm going to undo that real quick. The info palette allows us to see the red, green, and blue pixels for any area. So if I come here over this blue helmet, let me choose a tool that will let me see that. Apply the crop. There we go. All right, so if I move my cursor around, you can see that my blue value is at 114, red's at 33, green's at 63. So that's telling me I've got a lot of blue there. Same thing down here on his leg, lots of blue, not much else. If I come over here, we'll see spikes in the red area. If I come back here, we're going to see some spikes in the green areas. Not a whole lot there because it's not a super saturated kind of green. Now, if I bring back up my curves, and the shortcut for that is Command M. I'm just going to slide this out of the way. I can use that eyedropper there to see what those values are. And you see how now we have a slash between them? That's telling me the before adjustment and after adjustment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to brighten this a touch. I'm going to increase the contrast just a touch. And now I'm going to mouse around here, and I'm going to check in this white area here, and you can see, for instance, my red was at 238, it's now 243, green was 242, now 246, blue was 252, now 253. So I can use this, one, to see how much of an adjustment I've ended up with, and two, also to spot check to make sure I haven't blown my highlights. Like, we were pretty close over here, And yeah, we're at 255, 255, 254. So there's only a very, very small amount of blue left in that number there. And if I were to really go in here and hammer away at this and come in here now on his shoulder, you can see I'm at 255, 255, 255. There's absolutely no tonality left in there. So I don't want to do that. I want to try and preserve pixel data in as many places as I can. So again, I'm just going to increase my contrast a touch, not hugely. And I can check and uncheck preview to see where I was and now where I am. So levels and curves are going to be the ideal way of going in and adjusting the tonality in your images. And remember, all we want to do is overcome the mechanical limitations of the digital photography process, and we want to bring the image back to where we saw it, what we remember the light being and the quantity of light being in various situations. Now, I'm going to bring up one more image here real quick. This is another football image, and let me size it down in here, and we're just going to run through this to give you an idea of how quick this can be. So the first thing I'm going to do is hit the C key, and that's going to bring me back my crop tool. And I'm going to come in a little off the left, then a little off the right. And the reason I need to do that is, once again, I wasn't standing up straight. And if I don't come in a little off the edges, what will happen is I'll crop outside of the box, and I'll end up with some white in one of the corners there, and that's not going to look too good. So again, I'm going to de-emphasize this person over here. I'm going to de-emphasize these players over here so that I have more of a center of attention here. Now, I don't have him on the rule of thirds. I could move this in even more to get him on the rule of thirds, but I think there's enough visual movement in this frame that I can get away with that. Now, I walk my eye around the edges of the frame, and down here, see these shadows? That's bugging me a little bit, so I'm going to come up and I'm going to take those shadows out. I don't want any real distracting elements at the edges of my frame, so I'm going to hit hit return, and then Command 0 to make it a little bit bigger. I'm going to bring up levels by hitting Command L, and that looks good. It's pretty low out here, but if I hold down the Option key and slide in, you can see I'm going to very quickly start peeking some things out. So that brightened it just a touch. Now I'm going to hit Command M and bring up my curve here and slide it out of the way. I'm going to bring the overall brightness of this up a bit. All right, now as I brighten it, I'm going to flatten it out a little bit, so I'm going to add just a wee bit of contrast in there, because that light was kind of contrasty out there before and after. Now, the other thing that I can do is I'm looking at this and my color isn't really clean. So a very quick way to adjust color is to go back into curves, and down at the bottom of the curve you're going to find these three eyedroppers. One of them is black, one of them is gray, one of them is white. What these will do is this will allow me, I'm going to pick up the gray one here, is I'm going to be able to mouse over and I can look at those red, green, and blue values, and I can say, okay, I know that this is that standard aluminum sort of seating out there. All three red, green, and blue pixels should be pretty close because that's a neutral tone. So because it's a neutral gray, they should be, 125, 125, 125, but I can see my blue here is a little bit low, which is telling me that my image is a little bit yellow. With that gray eyedropper selected, if I click here, what it's doing is it's telling Photoshop, this point where I just clicked, this is a neutral tone. So if you look, 125, 129, 110, in that info red, green, and blue, I'm going to click, and it brought them closer together to 119, 122, 122. Now this one a little bluish overall, so I'm going to just come down here a little bit more and click again, and that got me a little bit closer. And now I'm just doing it a little bit by eye, which is a little dangerous because I'm not necessarily working in a calibrated color situation. But if I go ahead and click preview there, yeah, took some of that color cast out. Not a lot, but that's a quick way to go in and do a very quick color correction in your images, just using that gray eyedropper. Right? So that's cropping your images, and that's toning using levels and curves with a little bit of color correction in it. This presentation has been brought to you by the Henry W. Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. For more videos in this series, visit us online at visualjournalism.info/diglit.